In the dry heart of Australia, under a relentless sky, a bulldozer growls across a barren paddock. But it's not carving a road or tilling the soil. It's digging a grave, not for livestock, not for waste. For wool, freshly shorn premium-grade merino fleece, white, soft, pristine, is being buried by the ton. Bales roll into wide trenches, covered hastily with soil. No ceremony, no witnesses, no headlines. This is the fate of a product once hailed as white gold. In a country that built its fortune on the back of sheep, this act is not just shocking, it's symbolic. Welcome to a story of economic collapse, environmental contradiction, and a nation caught between heritage and survival. This is what happens when the most sustainable fiber on Earth becomes worthless. To understand why wool is being buried, you have to understand what it once was. For over a century, Australia wasn't just a wool producer. It was the world's wool superpower. By the 1950s, wool accounted for over one-third of the country's total export revenue. Sheep outnumbered people more than 20 to 1. The phrase, "Australia rides on the sheep's back," wasn't a metaphor. It was national identity. Wool towns thrived. Places like Goulburn, Wagga Wagga, and Armidale. Shearing season was a ritual. Schools closed for wool festivals. Shearers were local heroes. The economy pulsed with the rhythm of the shearing shed. At the center of it all was the merino sheep, selectively bred to produce ultra-fine, high-quality wool unmatched anywhere in the world. The wool mark, introduced in 1964, became an international symbol of quality, stamped onto garments from Tokyo to Milan. But then came the 1970s, and the synthetics. Petroleum-based textiles like polyester and acrylic began to infiltrate global markets. Cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to handle, synthetic fibers quickly gained favor among clothing manufacturers chasing mass affordability. By the 2000s, synthetics made up over 60% of global fiber consumption. Wool, by contrast, fell below 2%. Though natural, breathable, and biodegradable, wool simply couldn't compete on price or speed. Where polyester could be spun, dyed, and stitched in days, wool required careful processing, washing, combing, and skilled labor. Still, Australia's wool industry adapted. Premium fleece found its way into luxury fashion. Niche markets embraced it: ski wear, blankets, and bespoke tailoring. But the bulk market, the big volume buyers, kept shrinking. And then came COVID. In 2020, when COVID-19 shut down the world, wool auctions ground to a halt. Factories in Italy, China, and India suspended orders. Shipping containers stalled imports. Retailers stopped buying. Australia's Eastern Market Indicator, a key pricing tool, dropped from over 1,800 cents to under 900. That meant wool was fetching less than half its former value. But the sheep didn't stop growing fleece. The shears didn't stop moving. Wool kept coming, but the buyers didn't. By mid-2021, estimates suggested over 300,000 tons of Australian wool were sitting unsold. Warehouses overflowed. Farmers stored bales in barns, garages, even under tarps and open paddocks. Storage fees rose, insurance lapsed, rats chewed through bags, some wool began to rot. And with transport costs higher than potential sale prices, many wool growers made a quiet, desperate decision. They began to bury it. At first, it was a few small farms, families digging holes behind their shearing sheds to get rid of 20 or 30 bales. But as prices stayed low and hope faded, the practice spread like silent wildfire. In the Riverina region, a co-op of wool growers buried over 700 bales in early 2022. In Victoria's Western District, some dug trenches as long as 100 meters, covering wool with lime to prevent odor and pests. "It felt like digging a grave for my father's legacy," said Jason McCabe, a third-generation wool grower near Ballarat. "But storing it cost more than the wool was worth. We had no choice." The cost breakdown was brutal. Storage up to $1.50 per bale per week. Transport $300 per truckload minimum. Processing halted or delayed indefinitely. The math was clear: burying was the cheapest and fastest option. Wool, unlike polyester or nylon, is 100% biodegradable. It contains nitrogen, sulfur, and keratin, elements that can actually enrich soil if decomposed properly. So, in theory, burying wool could benefit the land. Agronomists and soil scientists began monitoring burial sites. Some farmers reported greener pasture growth over former burial trenches. Others experimented with mixing wool into compost to create nutrient-rich mulch. The University of Melbourne ran a trial in 2022 on wool-enhanced topsoil. Results showed improved water retention and reduced soil erosion, particularly in drought-affected areas. But the reality wasn't universally positive. When wool decomposes without oxygen, say deep underground or in tightly compacted pits, it can produce methane. That's the same gas that belches from landfills in cattle, and it's 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Preliminary studies suggested that each ton of buried wool could release up to 70 kilograms of methane if improperly decomposed. That's the emissions equivalent of driving a car 300 kilometers. And most burial pits weren't monitored. They weren't designed for aeration. They were crisis responses, fast and unregulated. Australia may have avoided economic disaster on one front, only to risk an environmental one on another. Beyond the economics and emissions, the cultural cost was devastating. Wool wasn't just a product, it was a craft, an identity. In the small town of Baroa, a shearing school that once trained over 100 students a year closed in 2023. No demand, the instructor said. No future. Shearers, once seen as some of the most skilled tradesmen in rural Australia, have begun leaving the industry. Some are retraining as electricians, mechanics, even baristas in the city. Wool's not a job anymore, said Declan, 24, who left the shed for construction work. It's a memory. In Indigenous communities, the burial struck a different chord. On shared grazing lands, the mass disposal of fleece was seen not just as economic failure, but cultural disrespect. Wool was part of our trade, part of our story, said Elder Alinta Carr from the Wiradjuri Nation. You can't bury that and call it progress. The burial of wool was no longer just a desperate act. It became a symbol of what gets lost when markets move faster than memory. While Australia buried its fleece, the global textile machine kept churning. Fashion brands continued pushing synthetic blends. Eco collections from big names still featured mostly plastic-based fabrics labeled as recycled or sustainable. And yet, over 35% of microplastics found in oceans today come from synthetic textiles. Released every time they're washed, wool, by contrast, sheds nothing toxic. It breaks down naturally in land or sea. Countries like Germany and Italy still buy fine Australian merino for luxury goods, but those markets are small, selective. They don't have room for hundreds of thousands of surplus bales. The rest, it goes into the ground. Despite the devastation, not everyone gave up. In Victoria, a startup named Eco Wool Solutions began collecting discarded fleece to turn into acoustic insulation panels. Wool's natural sound dampening and fire-resistant properties made it perfect for eco-friendly construction. In South Australia, wool pellet coeds turned waste fleece into nutrient-rich fertilizer pellets, ideal for vineyards and orchards. Each pellet broke down slowly, nourishing soil without leaching chemicals. The Australian Wool Innovation AWI agency launched a grant initiative in 2023, funding over a dozen small-scale sustainability pilots. These included wool geotextiles for erosion control, biodegradable wool weed mats, wool biochar soil conditioners. But the problem wasn't innovation, it was scale. These startups processed thousands of kilos. The buried wool represented hundreds of thousands of tons. Without large-scale infrastructure, subsidies, and coordinated market intervention, these efforts, however noble, remained drops in an ocean of waste. Australia's wool burial story isn't just about economics. It's about moral contradiction. This is a nation that markets itself as clean, green, and sustainable, a world leader in renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and conservation. And yet, behind closed gates and unmarked paddocks, it buried one of the most sustainable fibers on the planet. Why? Because the global system didn't find it profitable. It's a haunting metaphor that when sustainability costs too much, we bury it, literally. That when the market shifts, even heritage can be discarded. And it forces uncomfortable questions. What else are we willing to bury when it stops turning a profit? What traditions do we abandon when the math no longer works? But maybe all is not lost. 2023, she planted native legumes and grasses across that burial field. Today, it's the most fertile paddock on her property. The wool came back, she says, not as product, but as pasture. In a strange twist of fate, the very act that symbolized despair is now offering renewal, a closed-loop redemption. Across Australia, dozens of growers are experimenting with what they call fleece farming, using buried or shredded wool as regenerative soil input, not waste. They speak less about markets now and more about stewardship. It's not about selling, says wool grower Martin Lang from WA. It's about restoring. So what does it mean to bury wool? To take a legacy product, natural, renewable, centuries old, and entomb it. Not because it failed, but because the system failed to value it. It means this: we don't just bury fleece, we bury memory, craft, continuity, But wool has a strange property. Even underground it lives, it breathes, it feeds soil, it waits. Perhaps that's the lesson. That sustainability doesn't always win the market, but it endures. That true value isn't always visible on a spreadsheet, and that sometimes what we bury can grow again. Because under that dead soil, in the silence of paddocks no longer profitable, something is still stirring. And when the world is finally ready to listen, the wool will still be there. That's all for now. If you like the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe the channel so that you don't miss the next mind-boggling video we are working on. See you soon.